Hey everybody, how's it going? Thanks for joining me this afternoon. I've got a great stream with a great guest that I think you're really going to enjoy. So, I think a lot of people, of course, look at the GOP in general, but specifically a lot of conservative leaders and ask themselves, why is it so important to these people that they have to be loved by their enemies? Why are they constantly bowing and scraping for the approval of those that seem to hate them? What is the dynamic where people who should be representing me, should be representing my interests, should care about my values, my family, the place I live? Why do they seem so much more interested in signaling to the people who live in New York or somewhere in California or in Washington, D.C., than to trying to reach my goals, achieve the things that I elected them or paid them or listen to them because I want them to move towards these issues? What is this driving mechanism? And today, discussing that topic with me is a YouTube commentator, a guy with a great interview show, Jay Burden. Thanks for coming on, man.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me on, Auron.
Yeah, it was great. I got to meet you when we had the Skildings event. And of course, I've been on your show. Lots of our friends have been on there, guys. So make sure that you check that out. Jay's always got great conversations going on over at his channel. But we want to dive into this topic of regime conservatism. Why is it so popular? Why does it seem that the base is demanding more and more from their leadership, more and more from their politicians, more and more from their commentators, and yet there's this constant division even when the base, the customers, the voters, the people who should be driving the interests of these people, why are they not getting a response? Why do all of these people seem still stuck back in the 1990s or 90s or something when it comes to political opposition? We're going to dive into all that, guys, but before we do, let's hear about Miracle Sheet. Did you know that your temperature at night can have one of the greatest impacts on your sleep quality? If you wake up too hot or too cold, I highly recommend that you check out Miracle Made's bed sheets. Inspired by NASA, Miracle Made uses silver infused fabrics and makes temperature regulating bedding so you can sleep at the perfect temperature all night long. Using silver infused fabrics inspired by NASA, Miracle Made sheets are thermoregulating and designed to keep you at the perfect temperature all night long, so you get better sleep every night. These sheets are infused with silver that prevents up to 99.7% of bacteria growth, which lets them stay clean and fresh 3 times longer than other sheets. Miracle sheets are very comfortable without the high price tag of other luxury brands and feel as nice as bed sheets used by some 5-star hotels. You don't need to sleep with bacteria that clogs your pores, causing breakouts and acne. Instead, you can sleep clean with Miracle. Go to trymiracle.com/Auron to try Miracle Made sheets today. And whether you're buying them for yourself or as a gift for a loved one, if you order today, you can save over 40%. And if you use the promo code Auron at checkout, you'll get 3 free towels and save an additional 20%. Miracle is so confident in their product, it's backed with a 30-day money-back guarantee. So if you aren't 100% satisfied, you'll get a full refund. So upgrade your sleep with Miracle Made today. Go to trymiracle.com/Auron and use the code Auron to claim your free 3-piece towel set and save over 40%. Again, that's trymiracle.com/Auron to treat yourself. All right, Jay. So you suggested this topic, and I thought it was important because it's timely. There's another example of this that's kind of popped up here recently. Could you explain a little bit about kind of Rod Dreer and his background with regime conservatism, kind of signaling in these really public ways that he's on the right side when it seems necessary to him?
So, sure thing. So, I think you and I both are on a similar page that we don't like drama, right? So, I'm not trying to turn this into kind of a personal attack on Rod past what it's kind of
Right.
necessary to do so. I've met him in person. He was very kind to me. That's not what I'm doing here.
Yeah.
So, Dreyer, for those who don't know, has had a relatively long career. He was at the American Conservative for quite a long time. He had his blog there that a lot of people read. And he had a series of books that were kind of, at least the first two, were kind of ahead of the curve for conning. His first one, Crunchy Cons, is kind of a book about right-wing hippies, right? So people like Joel Salatin, that kind of thing. Now, the book that was kind of his breakout, one that was extremely influential on me, is a book called The Benedict Option, which is basically a book where he makes an argument that conservatives, and particularly religious conservatives, need to change how they think about culture and the culture war. Essentially, that just like Benedictine monks, right, we are not in a position of power anymore. We need to think about essentially retreating, creating our own enclaves, our own kind of parallel societies, and manage our own affairs like that. Admittedly, that's now kind of a tired argument, but at the time it was fresh for a lot of people. Now, most interestingly to this specific event, he wrote a book called Live Not by Lies, which is this kind of, to be honest, this little bit moralizing book about how conservatives, good people, need to basically completely divorce themselves from the lies of culture and not allow themselves to be browbeaten into going along with lies, hence the kind of quote from Solzhenitsyn there. And he uses a lot of direct quotes and kind of anecdotes from Christians behind the Iron Curtain, basically Christians who were under an atheist hostile regime. So fair enough at this point, right? Like, even if you don't like those books, at least there's some kind of consistent line through them. But what's interesting, right, is that Dreer writes one thing and he does another. So the kind of topical part is essentially there's been a news story going around where this traditional Catholic kid got into a Fed honeypot on the internet and got his house raided by the feds, right? Allegedly, the things said, and I should say allegedly because he's a minor, the court documents are sealed. Rod Dreer has published them.
Yeah, that's really important to this. Like, he claimed claimed to have the information from sealed documents from this guy, and he said, like, this is the reason I know everything that's going on. And then it turned out he didn't, and it was something different. But anyway, sorry, go ahead.
Right, exactly. And the reason this is relevant is because initially Dreer had said, like, go help this kid out. Oh, wait, this kid may have said something I don't approve of. I'm going to publicly basically go forward and say, like, don't give to this. This is bad. So let's just take an aside. I don't know what actually happened here. There's a very real possibility this kid does or said things that I don't agree with, right? But, we know as both Christians, the normal, policy there is either confront someone privately, or if you think that someone, especially one of your people, right, this guy's a conservative Christian, don't make this into a big dramatic thing, take it down quietly. And if that were the case, we wouldn't be having this discussion. But, right, there is a significant amount of cultural clout to be created, right, from turning this into a mountain where you can plant your flag and say, I'm a conservative, but you know what I hate more than anything else? Those people over there, the people who are to the right of me. And so initially, right, on the face of it, that doesn't make sense, right? Like, if we view American politics as a fight between two equivalent parties, right, left-wing America and right-wing America, why would you want to essentially sell out to your enemies? Give them a leg up. So if you steel man the position of Dreer and more regime conservatives, David French, for one, springs to mind, they would say, well, I'm just so principled. I would rather lose 1,000 times than win dishonestly. And they may believe that. I'm not entirely convinced, right? But that is a thing that people have said. But one of the things that I think is integral to understanding this is an idea Moldbug, Curtis Yarvin, he came up with, right? Which is that essentially the Republicans and the Democrat, the right and the left in America, they're not the same thing. They are two parts of a similar organization with different functions. So he described Blue America, the Democrats, the liberals, whatever you want to say, as the inner party. And the inner party is the party of power. Basically, the Democrats are to politics what GM is to car reviews, right? GM always seems to win somehow. And you find out, well, to be honest, it's because they own a lot of those places, similar to the Yankees. They're kind of the default. And the Republicans are always kind of playing catch up. And so what he basically said is, and I realize I've been talking a good bit, Auron, I'll throw it back to you, is that essentially the Republicans aren't a real party. They're essentially a party designed to, one, manage dissent, and two, to essentially gather resources from their base. They're not a party interested in winning. And you see this very clearly when these kind of regime conservatives get into power. What do? Absolutely nothing. What they certainly don't do is increase their power or the power of their base. And so I think that this kind of specific instance in which Dreer makes his true allegiances known, right, which is to the true party of power, is kind of a crystallization of that. Do you see what I'm getting at, Auron?
Absolutely. And yeah, I think there's a couple things here that are important. First, like you said, um, a lot of these people do believe this. So I really have zero doubt that Dreher and um uh uh David French believe that they are principled and that they are doing this. In fact, I think a lot of people inside the GOP, inside Republican, apparatus, inside Conservative Inc., they believe what they're saying. There's really not there's when I was outside, any of this stuff, and I had never interacted with any of this stuff, I thought there's a lot of, oh, well, someone's in on it. Like at some level, these people are winking and nodding about how they're managing this stuff. But I think a lot of these people really do believe 100% that they are doing something correct. But the incentives have lined up in a way that creates the dynamic that you're talking about. And this is always confusing for people because they think that when I say things like if the Republican Party vanished, that would be that would be the most dangerous thing for the regime. Like that would put the regime in a far more dangerous situation than a Republican victory. They think, oh, well, then you think there's some conspiracy inside the Republican Party to control all political dissent. It's like, no, but its existence allows for that dynamic to exist because it creates that situation that you're talking about. So I think it's difficult for people to understand how someone could fully believe that they're doing the right thing, that they're fighting the correct fight, but could simultaneously then act as a piece of controlled opposition, or could show regime loyalty, could be the outer party in a way that is helpful to the inner party.
Well, definitely. And so that default status that I mentioned, in addition to kind of being the winner, right, in this game, you also control what is high status.
Mhm.
And so a lot of what we're talking about is actually people seeking status, right? Like the low end version of that, like, well, what's cool? And the high end version of that is essentially, what do smart people do? And if you look at smart people things, they're effectively becoming a Democrat, right? So for instance, right, like smart people hate Trump. And why do they hate Trump? Well, he's backwards, mean, racist, all of those things, right? High class, and I'm putting all of this in quotes, people aren't like those other kind of like gross conservatives, right? And so that's kind of the dynamic I'm talking about. And by controlling that kind of prestige network, you essentially filter that out. And it's not necessarily like there's some mustache twirling villain at the top saying like, oh yes, Rod Dreher, write this article. Not at all. But it's when you control the kind of mechanisms of culture, right? Like, let's be honest, we all know what every actor, who do they vote for, right?
Mhm.
Exactly. Similarly to the Ivies, anything like that, essentially the institutions of legitimation, right? Where if you're an elite, what makes you more elite? Well, essentially getting more gold stars from the regime, admittedly in different forms. But if you kind of follow that up, it's not truly neutral, right? And so what's interesting is you actually go to Dreher's book. He's very, very good at pointing this out. Good at pointing out how in the Soviet Union, if you were a person of faith, even if you didn't face direct oppression, right? Even if you didn't necessarily have to go to a gulag, well, you were seen as backwards. You were seen as a rube. You were blocked from certain professional organizations, even if not by law, just because it would make that organization less prestigious if you were a part of it. And so that mechanism essentially allows what would have been at one time kind of controversial political opinions to be relegated to essentially the layer of social acceptability, right? Where very well, right? If you in your previous career as a teacher made what were normal opinions on gay marriage, 25 years ago, if you said that, I mean, there's a very real possibility you'd be looking for a job.
Oh,
And
absolutely.
that's and you can see that trend applied at essentially every layer of society. And so I guess that my point in this is not just to kind of, ramble about prestige, but it's that in controlling what is acceptable, what's good, what smart people do, you can kind of pull all of society along by the nose.
Absolutely. There's a reason that every one of these people complains about why they don't have a New York Times bestseller, or you can tell which ones have the opportunity to get a New York Times bestseller. It's not the person who would actually sell the most books, it's the person who would please or would be acceptable to those that make the selection at the paper. And there's never any interest in finding a different way to credential or legitimize themselves. They're more interested in appearing favorably in the pages of already established papers that would create social cachet. And that's what gives them their status inside the conservative movement, oftentimes, right? That's what gives them access to fundraising. That's what gives them access to establishment politicians, the ability to suggest legislation, the ability to be a mover and shaker is tied to this. That's why somebody like Mitch McConnell, who couldn't be further from the interests of the average conservative, wields so much power inside inside the Republican Party, because he holds all kinds of positions that give him access to money and power, that allow him to decide who's going to be able to get fundraising and financing handed and doled out to them. And that happens inside the GOP, but of course it also happens inside the halls of conservative thought leadership, think tanks, media, those kind of things. And so being closer to regime respectability grants you this status even inside the opposing movement, which then means that the left is always dictating, like you said, who's getting status handed out to them.
Well, and definitely, right? And you see that sort of is at the core of the problem, which is for conservative elites, right? These kind of like large figures in the generally Republican leaning sphere, essentially, who are their patrons and who are their clients, right? To look at it very, very kind of like simply. And the problem is, from one perspective, people like you and I are literally, in some cases, their patrons, right? Like many of these people receive donations from normal conservative Americans or from conservative businesses. And so from that, you would logically think, well, I should get something for it. I should get some representation. And while they're very happy to take your money, you cannot give them the prestige that a normal organization, quote unquote, normal organization can, right? And so essentially, you see that, well, what happens when a conservative elite violates some kind of core tenet of the Republican base, right? Like when a conservative elite says something like, okay, well, maybe, actually, this is a perfect example, gay surrogacy, right? The idea that two men can get, quote unquote, married, essentially smuggle a child into the country. Well, if you look at the base, that is a very, very unpopular thing. But you can get all of the congratulations you want from probative conservative voices, right? Now, if we kind of flip that around, we have someone say something that is very, very popular about the conservative base. But I mean, you can imagine what would happen if someone at, Fox News on air basically said, I think that's child smuggling and they should be thrown in jail. I mean, they may not completely lose their job, but they would face much, much more pushback. Right.
Yeah,
and
they're probably not getting any choice spots on the shows in rotation.
100%. And the reason that I bring this up is not just to complain that it's not fair, right? That's kind of trite, but to say that this is not a dualistic system, right? This is not two equal and opposite forces pushing against each other. It is kind of the inner and outer party, right? And so that's truly one of the interesting things I think Trump brought up, right? Is this idea of the swamp. The idea of rhinos, which has existed for a while, but very clearly delineating the difference between people like, Mitch McConnell and the base. And so I think that is an interesting split to watch take place, because you can tell they're kind of uncomfortable about it. Like they don't like talking about that. Oh, yeah. And anytime there's a chance to essentially close that gap, right? Like Liz Cheney, no matter how distant it is, but a chance to have a Republican who can, quote unquote, save the soul of the nation, they kind of jump on it and give people who have no charisma or really traction with the base an absolutely inordinate amount of screen time and support from kind of official press outlets.
Yeah, the Nikki Haley, just out of nowhere, no connection to where we're talking about now. She's surging. with support among Democrats. It's thought I'd mention that just
for no reason at all.
no reason at all. Yeah, no, I want to get into that Trump dynamic because I think that's really essential. That what you just hit on there, and why that splits away from the machine, and why that scares people in both the GOP and the Democratic establishment. But before we get to that, guys, let me tell you about job stacking. These days, it's impossible to thrive with just one job. Between increasing living costs, paying off debts, and planning for the future, things like buying a home, building savings, and even going on vacation can seem like fantasies. If your goal is financial freedom, you could start taking on more hours at your current job, work towards a promotion, or try putting your money into something risky like stocks, cryptocurrencies, or even a side hustle. But at the end of the day, do you really want to sacrifice time and energy that could otherwise be spent with your loved ones or on your hobbies just to make a living? Luckily, you don't have to hustle to reliably make more money. All you have to do is job stacking. Job stacking is the best way for regular people, regular employees, to unleash their earning potential and increase job and financial security. How? By working multiple jobs, but without burning out or, more importantly, getting caught by corporate overlords. Job stacking allows you to reliably receive paychecks from multiple employers each month without having to work more than 8 hours a day. You don't have to be in tech or any particular field or industry to do it, as long as you can work remotely. If you've thought about working multiple jobs but you're not sure how to start or are afraid of getting caught, get the fundamental job stacking course today and learn all of the secrets on how to sustainably work multiple full-time jobs from the foremost expert on the matter, Rolf Haltze, author of Job Stacking. Rolf has worked multiple full-time jobs since 2018, including hybrid jobs, and has condensed all of his experiences and wisdom into a single 4-module online course so you can start proficiently job stacking without having to make mistakes, figuring things out on your own, or reinventing the wheel in the process. Go to www.jobstacking.com and enter the promo code Auron to get a special discount. All right, Jay. So you were talking about this thing that Trump introduced with the swamp, right? And everyone noticed how difficult it was for Trump to get things done, of course, when he got in. But even coming into the conversation, it was very clear who was arrayed against him, how he was dangerous to the establishment, how they were willing to elevate pretty much anyone but him. And it's very weird because Trump is a blue dog Democrat at best, right? This is a guy who was like waving pride flags on stage. Like, this is a guy who still talks about how much he likes Caitlyn Jenner and stuff. Like, this is not a far right guy by anybody's real imagination. But for some reason, the media and even the GOP establishment treat him like he's this crazy radical bomb thrower, even though his positions are at the very best center left. And I think the answer as to why that really is that he reveals kind of the controlled nature of the situation. He doesn't have ideological barriers. He just says what he thinks the base wants to hear. A lot of people might think that's like a downside of somebody. I get that, like, oh, he's unprincipled. He just says what people want to hear. But that means he ends up reflecting the actual interests of the base rather than the way that they are supposed to be kind of herded by the establishment. And that means he's kind of channeling the zeitgeist of actual middle America. And that terrifies the establishment at this point.
Well, definitely. And so that I think that a lot of people, particularly kind of conservative Americans, and I just want to say this, I'm not saying this to punch down. These are my people. And part of the reason that I get so worked up about this is these are my people, right? And they're getting a raw deal. Is essentially a lot of red Americans have been sold a lie about politics. And politics at its most fundamental level is punishing your enemies, rewarding your friends. And essentially, what the right has been given for, let's just be honest, the last 50 to 60 years is that, okay, vote us in, we'll leave you alone. Nothing else. And don't get me wrong, given the alternative of someone sticking their finger in your eye, I mean, I guess that's preferable, but that is not the same deal that you get on the other side of the aisle, right? You will get rewarded. For being a Democrat client, let's take the example of trans people, right? If you're transgender right now, you can sign up with the US military, get your surgery paid for, and get an indefinite waiver to deploy, which basically means you get a free check from the government, expensive medical care, you have no uniform registration requirements, and you don't have to do anything. Right. Whereas, let's be honest, if you're a white boy from Oklahoma and you sign up, I mean, are you getting any one of those? Exactly. And so that's a very crystallized example. You see it in other places as well, right? The way the college debt is set up, the way civil rights law is set up, that there is active discrimination for Democrat clients. And so when we look at the Republican situation, we have one person, Trump, and I'll be honest, I've never voted for the man. I don't really vote, but who kind of teases the idea that, like, hey, vote for me and I might do something for you. And people lose their mind.
Yeah.
And you see people who don't have this idea of patronage, right? Vote for me and I'll do something for you. They kind of can't understand the phenomenon. They're like, well, why can't DeSantis or blah, blah, blah do the same thing? They have the same policies. And the dirty little secret is policy doesn't matter. No one, like, legitimately, no one cares. If you ever talk to someone who isn't a massive politics nerd, you'll figure this out pretty quickly. Unfortunately, most of the people who write about politics are politics nerds. But essentially, right, even the whiff of that, and people don't just have loyalty to the platform, they have loyalty to the man. And we're seeing a much more, weirdly enough, honest version of politics than what we've been sold for the last 50 to 60 years. And so I think that it's sort of two things at once, which is, one, Trump never really got the memo that the Republican Party isn't a real party. You know, he's like, oh, well, I'm in charge. I guess I'm in charge.
Yeah.
And, well, I guess I'm in charge, so I might as well, you know,
I deliver
I
deliver what the customer wants, right? Like, that's my job. Like, I'm in the head of the business. My job is to serve the customer. And yeah, he didn't get the memo that he's actually supposed to be filtering what the customer wants, not delivering it.
100%. And part of that is that, again, it goes back to that idea that this is not really a two-party state. You know, there is one system for power and prestige. And alternatively, you know, you're essentially, your job is, like you said, to filter the customer. You know, it's essentially to keep a certain part, the non-client groups, happy enough to not cause problems and use them as an economic battery to power the patronage machine of the other side. And so it's a little bit of a simplistic model, but it very accurately predicts what we've seen. And again, it's one of those things where you can very clearly see in a situation like this one, where there's controversy, there's a lawsuit involved, where their true allegiances lie. You know, when there's a moment of crisis, who do they default to, right? Do they default to saying, I don't know the details, I'll just shut up? Or do they essentially feed someone into the maw of the beast? You know, use this opportunity to increase their cachet with this monster. And when someone does that, I would advocate, don't forget it. You know, Dreer's done this before. He's canceled people before. And when we look at, like, okay, what should we do? Because obviously, you know, in this whole conversation about Netter, no enemies to the right, people have brought up, well, what if someone who's politically allied with me does something morally inexcusable, right? Substitute your favorite crime in there. Well, to be honest, right, that should be something that you and I think about. That does present a moral quandary. But at the same time, sacrificing them on the altar of Baal to get good boy points from the regime, that's probably not it, to be perfectly honest, especially when you're doing it to get internet clout.
Yes,
you know,
that's really critical. This is so hard for some people, because they can't draw this line, but it's really essential. Your moral duty in how you're going to interact with the situation is not the same as your need to publicly, fillet the administration or the regime. Like, those are not the same thing. Like, if you're looking to increase your status by showing how much you can throw someone under the bus, you can sacrifice an enemy, how willing you are to bend over backwards whenever you have the opportunity to show that you're ultimately loyal, or you're ultimately capitulating to those in power, you're really revealing to yourself that this is my main interest, that not the actual worrying about, like, how I should interact with the morality of the situation. Your moral response is something, like you said, often in a situation, it's going to need to be something that you are doing in private, or it's something that is held tight inside a community, or perhaps it is simply something like stepping away, removing a public support for someone who is behaving badly or is beyond the pale. That is not the same as going to the other side and saying, I would like to show you that I am worthy of your respect by publicly going out of my way to destroy this person. These are very different behaviors. And what one is the way that you should actually address something in a moral situation, and one is the mask I'm putting on or the demonstration I'm putting on for public credibility.
Well, definitely. And this is the deepest irony in this is that Dreyer himself gets this, right? In that book I mentioned, The Benedict Option, which is very influential on me, he talks about that, right? That when you have a community, when you deliberately create a community, it has to be policed from the inside, right? Very successful parallel societies like the Amish and the ultra Orthodox, they've done this well. And so if we look at like, okay, like let's say I believe that premise, right? That Christian conservatives are no longer a majority group and they need to act like a minority group, like specifically a parallel minority group. Well, let's look at successful parallel minority groups, complicated societies that exist kind of completely apart from the broader American one. Well, and what do? They don't do this, right? You don't have Amish people writing up, like self-flagellating 1,400 word posts on Substack. Realize the Amish part might kind of but you understand my point. And what's especially galling about this is that this is a pattern of behavior, right? I won't get into the Thomas Accord affair, but essentially what Dreyer did is took a very, very small instance of, should we say, unbecoming behavior, right? The headmaster of a small Christian school Dreyer was connected to had an Anon account. He was connected to Stephen Wolfe of Christian nationalist fame. Some Antifa account found it, doxed him, and he was going to get let go from his job for saying edgy things on the internet, right? Probably there's a good reason to say that the school had grounds to let him go because he lied about it. So fair enough, right? But if that's just that is essentially a personnel matter at a 100-person school. No one hears about it. But what Dreyer does is the same mechanism, right, to get that prestige as one of the good conservatives, right? I'm not like those guys, is he blows it up. And now it's a story in the New York Times, which that's a whole extra magnitude. You have taken this small problem and blown it up to a degree that is in the paper of record, quote unquote. And it ends up nuking this entire school. This man is now literally unemployable, cannot find a job over the entire continental US. He's driven all over the place. And multiple people lose their jobs. And now this whole institution is in flames. It is probably going to fold.
People have nothing to do with the initial quote unquote crime, that was the point of the witch hunt, are now being blown up by this, right?
100%. And why was that done? Well, to establish that Rod Dreyer is quote unquote principled, which means he will sacrifice his people into the maw of the beast, essentially to gather extra prestige, to get more clicks, to get more eyes. Because to be honest, his people, quote unquote, the people he wrote his books about, they're not his paymasters, right? They can't give him the currency he wants. And I think that what we see across the board looking at, whether you want to call these people rhinos, whether you want to call them swamp creatures, good conservatives, I use the term house conservatives, right? To kind of, mimic Malcolm X there, right? Is that essentially it's what we call elsewhere kind of a principal agent problem. That your representatives, right, the people that you give money to, well, they don't have the same goals you do. You may be thinking, Auron, oh, I am conservative. I give my money to conservatives. Therefore, they will act out that. They will essentially respect my end of the deal. We see that in many cases breaking down. And I guess that in all of this, kind of if you could drill it down to my thesis statement, it's essentially that find better patrons, because you're getting the raw end of the deal.
Yeah, and it's really important because when you are setting up these societies, like, okay, we have a small Christian school, right? This is the alternative institution. This is the thing that we're always telling people they should do. Separate yourself from the society, put yourself in a situation where you're delivering an alternative education, where there's an alternative set of interests, an alternative set of standards, an alternative morality that is being reinforced, that is removing you from the system. That's what you want. That's what you want from these communities. And when organizations like that know that somewhere inside that organization there's like a sleeper cell of people who ultimately are seeking the approval of someone outside of that organization. They will act in accord, with that instead of with the interest of the organization. That means that people are always on their toes. They can't really be on their own. They can't really have an alternative. They can't really have different morals, different values, a different culture, because ultimately they constantly have to be worried about the fact that someone inside the organization is really looking to better themselves with their enemies. And so they're constantly looking over their shoulder. They're constantly making decisions that are influenced by those people. And so this practice of going around and blowing up people, especially inside these small alternative organizations, for your own aggrandizement, it doesn't just hurt those individual people, though that itself is a tragedy. It also makes parallel institutions almost impossible because those people know that they cannot operate because you are specifically drawing scrutiny on top of those organizations for the amusement and aggrandizement or for the amusement of your enemies and your own aggrandizement. And that means that they just have no option to actually operate on their own.
Well, definitely. And that's sort of one of the secret power mechanisms the regime has, right? It's through civil rights law, through even just kind of the court of public opinion, for whatever that's worth. They've essentially created a nuclear option and given everyone a button, right? And if you are in an organization, particularly an organization that the regime does not like, all you have to do is essentially find a reporter, make something up, and essentially the wrath of God will come down and smite that person. You saw this with the UVA fraternity situation, right? Where essentially, let's be honest, fraternities are not explicitly political, but they're an all-male organization, and the regime doesn't like that, right? It's a fraternal society. I was not in Greek life. A lot of friends who were, so I'm not particularly biased on this point. But they find someone who, and this is at an elite Southern school, all male organization, that's kind of 3 ticks against it as far as the regime concerned. They get this completely made up story, turns out to be completely false. And Rolling Stone publishes a massive expose about sexual assault that happens at this fraternity. These kids have their lives ruined. And then we find out 3 to 5 years later that it was made up whole cloth, right? And so that's an example of that nuclear option. That if you can find a sympathetic ear to listen to, essentially it's a story people want to believe, right? Oh, those are, according to the regime, those are bad people. So this looks like a half decent story. Completely obliterate this. Again, another example is the Kavanaugh situation, right? That all of a sudden you have, shall we say, less than convincing stories popping out the woodwork, but they're lend credence because it is convenient for power to lend credence to these stories. This is another one, right? That would happen with Accord, where it's like, well, to be honest, it doesn't really matter. Like, this is not a big deal. Some guy said something inappropriate on social media. It happens all the time. But because small classical Christian schools are coded as enemies, right? Well, all of a sudden, this is a New York Times story. This really matters. I'll have you know there are dangerous Christian nationalists who are just one day away from taking over in America at schools like this. And so, again, right, it's another way in which this sort of can catapult someone to kind of stratospheric, like immense fame. I think it was her name Mattress Girl at UVA, or was that another one?
I'm trying to remember when that. Yeah, I don't know if that was UVA. It might have been.
But point is, right, you can catapult your career. Make yourself well known. And I hate to say it, this is how Dreer got famous. He got famous by writing about sex scandals in the Catholic Church, which admittedly were a problem. But at the same time, you start to look back, given what we know now, and even if everything he did then was perfect, it's absolutely perfect, nonetheless, right, it is a way that a lot of people make themselves very famous at the expense of enemies of the regime.
And you have to, like, there for the right to finally break free of this dynamic, they need alternatives. They need situations where they can be separate, they can be apart, and like you said, they can have communities that can guard themselves against this, which of course again is the irony because Dreer knows this. He's written about this. But we whether he understands the implications of his own writing or not, we have to understand this, that the people in power are more dangerous than bad people to our right, which does not mean that there aren't bad people. That doesn't mean that everyone on the right is perfect. It doesn't mean everyone on the right is doing the right thing. It doesn't mean that no one on the right is guilty and no one on the right is is doing something that's that should be reproached. However, it means that we have to understand that the people in power to the left, the people who are fighting for child castration and actually hold power inside the government and inside corporations, inside the military and all these incredibly powerful organizations, they are just way more dangerous than any individual who happens to hold bad beliefs, which doesn't mean those beliefs are okay or those actions are okay. But we have to understand where the priorities are, and we have to understand the cost of expending our energy going after people who are of no threat in general to society, as opposed to people who wield all of the power in society and are driving the cultural incentive system that is putting us in this position in the first place.
Well, I think that if we can distill this down to 2 bullet points, right? Like why did I come on the show? That's point number 1. And point number 2 is don't let your definition of kind of like what is good and high status come from your enemies. Mm-hmm. Because if they control what you think is high status, good behavior, you're completely done. So you see this with any number of issues, right? That once you have successfully coded something like, for instance, getting married and having kids young as backwards and low class, it disappears very, very quickly. I'm talking on kind of a broad scale. And so in that, right, you have to wonder of, well, okay, do the people who kind of mimic the behavior of high status, progressives in every way except for kind of n number of policy positions, right? Which way are they going? And that's a pretty easy answer. And so when we talk about building those parallel institutions, we also have to understand that if you're going to do that, you will never be seen in a broader context as hip and cool. Like you will have to fully commit to the fact that you are now low status. If you're one of the purebloods, right, the people who got through COVID, you're familiar with this, right? That essentially you had to get to a point where you're like, okay, guess what? I'm going to be treated like a criminal. I'm going to have to, do certain things, go certain places, essentially have a parole officer if you were at certain universities, like I was. And that's embarrassing, right? But if you're going to be a dissident, and this is the whole point of Dreer's 3rd book, if you're going to be a dissident, you have to do dissident things. And part of that is you're going to be seen as uncool. You're going to be seen as low status, and you're going to face essentially social consequences. And that's sort of the price of entry, I guess.
Yeah, Darren Beatty calls this the pain box, which I think he says if the guy is not in the pain box, then you shouldn't trust him. If someone is just riding high and receiving all the pats on the head from all the major outlets and is never paying a cost and is never being signaled as low status and all these things, then this person is not in the pain box. They're not somebody who's actually an enemy regime, which doesn't mean that people can't have success or doesn't mean that people don't gain popularity or status, because eventually you do want people to have that through the alternative system. But if the mainstream is patting these people on the head, or if they're making moves that constantly put themselves in that situation, they're not being put in the box, then that means that they're not really a threat. They're part of the regime. They're not somebody who's actually standing against it.
Well, definitely. And it is sort of one of those things where it's like, there are people who are to my right and who I don't like, people who I find, irritating or unproductive, but I've seen them take hits, right? Seen them take serious hits. And when you see someone have a controversial idea and really suffer for it, right? Like lose a job, lose money, lose social connections, and they keep going, it's a pretty good indication that they actually believe what they're saying. Mm-hmm. And I think that one of the things that we've sort of realized about the kind of current civic religion, right? Progressivism 2.0, is that essentially there are very few true believers, right? There are very few people who, if you really like held their feet to the fire, were like, I would suffer for this. I would lose status. I think it's a lot of people who are essentially are getting free stuff, and that's something you have to admire, that someone is basically willing to kind of go to the mat for what they believe, go to the pain box. And so you look at that and you're like, you know what? I don't agree with him on XYZ. He's a Greek statue poster on Twitter. I'm a Christian. Let's just not start this.
Right.
We're fighting Leviathan. And, maybe the guy who thinks that like actually being a gay Nietzschean, physique poster is the true way to get this. Maybe we're not in complete agreement, but to kind of paraphrase Sam Hyde, he doesn't think it. He doesn't want my kids dead. He doesn't want to castrate my kids, and he doesn't think it's funny. So that's kind of a basic friend-enemy distinction.
Absolutely. All right, guys. Well, we're going to pivot over to some questions we've got stacking up. But before we do that, Mr. Burden, where can everyone find your great work?
Yeah, definitely. Thank you for having me on. So the Jay Burden Show is an interview show, normally about an hour long. I've had Auron on, any number of people you may be familiar with. You can find that show on Apple, YouTube, Spotify, anywhere you listen to podcasts. And again, Auron, thank you so much for having me on.
Absolutely, man. All right, let's go ahead and answer some questions. So Deuce Boogaloo for $20. On Friday, I saw Shapiro react to a clip of Tucker and Dave Smith be befuddled by their shared disdain of Bill Buckley. Auron, could you please make a video explaining why the dissident right disapproves of Buckley and his legacy? Yeah, I commented on this. I'm actually going to have Dave Smith on tomorrow, so I can do you one better. I could just have a conversation about this with the guy responsible for this. To be clear, like Bill Buckley, it's not like everything Bill Buckley ever said is wrong, or he's like the guy all by himself that that drove everything that we've seen, all the failures. It's not say that Bill Buckley, there's work he did that was good. There are opinions he had that were correct. There are things to say in his defense. However, the main thing about Buckley and many people who are held in his position inside the conservative movement is you can see over and over again the times that he canceled people to his right, which is a big part of the conversation that we're having today. Buckley ran a lot of people out of the conservative movement that disagreed with him. He ultimately helped to cancel people like Pat Buchanan for having anti-immigration stances. He ultimately canceled a lot of people who warned about the excesses that would follow the Civil Rights Act and civil rights law. And so while Bill Buckley is certainly better than the vast majority of obviously like leftists and maybe even a number of people who have called themselves conservative throughout time, holding him up as some monolithic leader of the right who stood against everything that kind of came, I think that's the misunderstanding of history. I think that many of the moves that Buckley made pushed us in directions that we are now because they silenced voices that brought very important positions to the foreground, and those things stayed in the wilderness for a very long time until people like Trump and many on the dissident right were able to bring them back to the fore. And so it's not a wholesale condemnation of Buckley in every scenario, but it is pointing out the fact that the positions that he took and the ways that he influenced the conservative movement in many different crucial points silenced important voices or excised important opinions that put us in the situation we are.
If I can step in,
Absolutely.
Speaking of people who were canceled, Sam Francis's book "Beautiful Losers" is probably the resource I would start with. As with any truly "quote unquote" banned book, it's quite expensive to buy a copy. But hypothetically, if you wanted, there are places you can get it for free, and I'd recommend that as a primer on this topic.
Yeah, absolutely. It's an excellent book to kind of get you to understand that mindset here. All right, so no McSlob for $2. Thank you. Beaver Gang represent. That's your channel, right? It's,
it is. So thank you, Mr. McSlob.
Yes. All right. Cliff Jaded here. Keep your heads up. The lie can't last forever. Hi from Singapore. Big fan of both of you guys. Christ is king. Christ is indeed king. And thank you very much, man, I appreciate it. Tell me more about how Singapore is. I'm very interested. Deuce here again for $20. The right will win when they realize democracy in itself is a system that is left oriented because it's based on who's more willing to loot the treasury. And this creates the dependence culture that causes progressive decivilization. You're in great company making that point, of course. Hans Hermann Hoppe, Nick Land, Mencius Mulbug, many people who we have mentioned on this channel, respect, have done streams on, have written pieces on, make exactly this point, and so I think that's a very fair thing to point out, sir. John Carter here. You could say that Roger's family is a parallel community, as in his path and theirs never intersect. Yeah, I'm not super up on Dreer's personal life, and I don't want to make that what this stream is about. But I appreciate that, man. Cody Browning here. Auron, you're in the Beaver Gang now. Build the dam. Have I been initiated? I didn't even. I wasn't even aware.
So. It's a very strange cult, but you'll get your benefits package soon.
I've seen the Beaver posting, so I've seen that much. But yeah, I don't know. I don't know the secret handshake or anything. Flip bar for $10. Great show, fellas. Well, thank you, man. I really appreciate that. And yeah, guys, I really appreciate everybody for coming by. Of course, again, you should make sure to check out Mr. Burden's channel. Does lots of good interviews with people who have been on this show. Many people will be familiar with, but also new faces that you should definitely learn from. All right, guys, we're going to go ahead and wrap this up, but I want to go ahead and once again thank Mr. Burden for coming on. And if it's your first time on this channel, make sure that you go ahead and subscribe to the Auron MacIntyre Show on your favorite podcast platforms. And make sure that you go ahead and subscribe to the channel here if you want to watch these on YouTube. Of course, I'm also on Rumble and Odyssey. You can catch everything over on Blaze TV. Many different places for you to catch the show. But thank you guys for watching. And as always, I'll talk to you next time.